Hi, this is Nancy with On Point TV. We are continuing our series of a block by block quilt as you go. In the previous videos, we took you through making the blocks, properly cutting your sashings, and how to put your sashings around the block, and then how to cut your backing, your batting, and to do the basting. We're ready to proceed to the quilting section of the quilt. So before you can do the quilting with a block by block quilt, you need to be sure that you don't quilt where you're not supposed to. All right, so I'm going to show you this little drawing, and on the drawing you can see that block 1 has sashings that are not quilted. I say no quilting on those. Block 2 and block 3 also have one sashing that you are not to do any quilting on. Block 4, you can do all the quilting on those sashings. So one way that you can do this to remember which ones need quilting and which ones don't, because I generally kind of forget and have to end up unquilting things, is to put a piece of tape on the sashings. So I've used some of that painter's tape that we used for basting, and I put it on the sashings that there is no quilting on. I also wrote on that tape that this is block number 1, just to try to help me not get so confused. On block number 2, the tape is at the bottom, so that one is the only sashing that will not be quilted in this block. On block number 3, it is the side sashing that does not get quilted. And number 4, of course, he can have all of his sashings quilted. Now we're going to go to the sewing machine, and I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the stabilizing quilting that we'll do, and then the Appli Quilting that we'll do for stitching down the bias stems in our designs. So now we've moved to the sewing machine, so I can take you through the process of the Appli Quilting. But before I do that, I want to take you through some of the tools that I know and love, and I want you to get really used to, okay? First of all is invisible thread. Now my invisible thread is up here on my machine already. This is the cone style invisible thread that works really great when you have a thread holder to bring the thread up and down. Now this happens to be on my FAF icon, but there are also thread holders that can be off to the side of your machine if you don't have a machine that actually has it on the machine. You can also use ones that are more of a traditional spool, and if you're using invisible thread that is on a traditional spool, then it can just go in your machine like normal. The important thing about invisible thread is that it be very, very fine. And of all of the threads that I've used in modern day quilting, almost all of them are perfectly fabulous. The Sulky, the Superior, the this one is a YLI. But I'm going to name a brand that I would never normally say don't use this brand, but I've got to tell you, the Gutermann invisible thread is too thick. That's all I got to say about that. Don't use that one, okay? Use all of the other brands that I mentioned. There's polyester, there's nylon. I've never found a difference between any of them, and I know that for a while people were doing a debate. Which was the better one to use? Which one could be pressed? Which one couldn't? I have never noticed the difference. I could not tell you what the ones I use are actually made of. So all of those brands are wonderful, but the Gutermann invisible thread is too thick. So you don't want to use that one for this technique. I also want to use the proper needle. So the needle that I'm going to use is a Micro-Tek 60. Now this happens to be the Schmetz brand. I know that there are other brands that also make a Micro-Tek 60. This is the finest needle that you can use in your machine. I don't believe there's one finer. The 60 is very small. Invisible thread is just about the only thread that can go through a Micro-Tek 60 needle. I believe silk might be able to, and maybe if you were quilting with bottom line, but I really reserve my Micro-Tek 60s for my invisible thread. Next, I'm going to use the thread that I'm going to put on the bottom is going to be a Superior bottom line. The Superior bottom line is a very, very fine thread, and I'm going to show you some examples of what happens when you're not using a bottom line, because I started doing some without realizing I didn't have it in it. So I happen to have it on a large cone, and I've got some on a smaller, but I've just filled my bobbin with those. Then there's Lickety Grip. Lickety Grip is the product that I like to use on my hands instead of gloves. Now you can use quilting gloves if you want, but for a process like this, I just think it's kind of a bother. They're just kind of bulky, I think. So Lickety Grip just goes on your hand like this, and you rub it all over, and your hand kind of feels like a Post-it note. It just feels great. You can still pick up your scissors to do the cutting. You can still thread a needle even if you wanted to. So that's what Lickety Grip is all about. Comes in a cute little package like this, and it actually even has a little thing on the back so you can stick it to your sewing machine. I'm always traveling around, so I've never stuck it anywhere. And last is a pair of scissors. Now a normal pair of snipping scissors, just something that you can get close to nip, is going to be good, but there's so much of this, so like here's an invisible thread. I love these scissors that have that little bit of curve to them for that. Then when I'm cutting, I'm not having the point be right next to the quilt. I'm not worried that I'm going to accidentally cut into my quilt. So get yourself a pair of those. I think they're called embroidery scissors. You can probably find them at any sewing machine shop, because sewing machine shops sell embroidery machines, and that's the kind of scissor that embroiderers use to cut out of a hoop. We're going to next go to start doing the quilting and the Appli quilting on this quilt. I did want to show you what the threads look like on the back depending on what thread you use. So if you come down really close to this section right here, when I first started doing the work on this quilt, I had a Masterpiece 50 weight thread in the bobbin, and it was good. It wasn't that bad. I mean, it was a little noticeable, and I do like that you can see what my stitch looks like for the Appli quilting technique. But look at over here. Do you see the difference between the 50 weight and what a bottom line looks like? The bottom line is a much finer thread. And so the Masterpiece is fabulous for all things piecing, but when it comes to Appli quilting, I think that the bottom line thread is the best thread to use for this technique. So we're going to start, though, before we can do the Appli quilting, we first need to stabilize on our quilt. So we're going to first do some stitching. So I've already done one little line of stitching just here on the edge of the quilt. I do have my invisible thread in the machine, and now I'm going to stitch the sashings down. But here's the thing, I am going to stitch on the ledge. So this would be in the ditch, right there in between the white and the blue fabric. I am going to be on the ledge of the blue fabric. So if I flip this up, that's where the seam is. The seam is facing toward the border, or the sashing in this case. I want to quilt it so that the stitching is holding that all down right here on the ledge. I also, on this quilt, will stitch around the edges of the block, so on the ledge around and then on the edges, but not here. This is the number 2 block, and this is the block that I put the tape on the sashing where I cannot quilt. That means I don't even want to quilt on the ledge. No. I need to, for the block by block process, be able to pull this completely up, so you do not want to even do the on the ledge stitching for this. So let's go to the machine. So we're at my machine and we are set up for quilting. I do have my open toe applique foot on my machine. Now open toe applique feet come in a lot of different varieties. I like this one because it's only about 1/4 of an inch wide. There's other techniques that I like a wider one for, but for this technique I like this. And I'm working on a FAF, so my FAF sewing machine has a built-in walking foot. So if you do not have a FAF sewing machine, you will want to put on your walking foot for these next steps. I'm going to now do the on the ledge quilting. So like I said, it is just next to the edge of the sashing or the border, because this is the same stitch and same position I use when I am doing a border. It's always the first thing I quilt is on the ledge of my borders. And I'm going to go all the way around the quilt in this manner. Now I've come to the end of where I can quilt. Remember, I cannot quilt at all on this bottom sashing, so I'm going to cut off my thread and go back to the beginning and quilt all the way around the edge, because this can be quilted all the way around right there on the edge. Now this is just what I call my stabilizing quilting, keeping these edges down and the on the ledge right there at the sashing's edge. When it comes time to actually do the quilt design, we will move to my other machine and I'll show you the quilt design that I'll use for this quilt. And stop right there. Now we're going to set up to do the Appli Quilting stitch. For the Appli Quilting on my machine, keeping in mind this is a FAF icon, this is the stitch I like. So the stitch width is 1.2 and the stitch length is 1.5. If you just look a little bit up here on the FAF machine, what you see is what you get. So I know that that's the stitch length and width that I want. Every machine is different. You will have to find out what is your perfect stitch on your machine. On this machine also, I can do the tie off. With the tie off, I can tell it to tie at the beginning, to tie at the end when I cut my threads. And that's just a convenient part of this machine. Normally you would just do the normal tie off that you would want. Here's what we're going to stitch down. Now these are the ones that we glued down in the process of designing our quilted tiles. This particular green one has already been stitched down, and I want to show you on the back that you can see that that has already been stitched down. Now I'm going to proceed with some more pieces. I have my open toe applique foot on and I'm ready to go. As it goes down, it's going to take a couple of stitches in the place, that's the tie off, and then it's going to start stitching. Now I can see the zigging and zagging. It is zigging on, it is zagging off, on, off. When I turn, I always want to be sure that my presser foot is lifted, and then I can continue on, off, on, off. One reason I like using a zigzag stitch instead of the blind hem stitch is with the blind hem stitch, you will zig on one time and then go off for 3 stitches. Then zig on for 1 time and 3 stitches. And I just find that very confusing. When am I going on? When am I going off? And if I miss a stitch, I've generally gone too far. With this, I'm zigging on, off, on, off, on, off. Always being sure to lift my presser foot when I'm going around an angle. Now when I get near to the end here, know your machine. With my machine, I just hit my cut button. It is going to do the little tie off right there and cut it off. Now we're going to go to another section. I'm going to go to this section here. Right here I'm going to start with my little locking stitch and then on, off, on, off, on, off. I want to show you this because this is where you need to stop. When this bar goes across, you never want to stitch on that bar in these long lines. You're going to want to stop right before that crossbar. Come to the end. Actually, I'm going to hit my reverse button. That will give me my locking stitch. Then it does my lock and my cutoff right there. Now let's go to the inside edge of this long blue bar. Starting right here, my machine does its little locking stitch, so whatever you need for your locking, and then proceed. Going on and off, stopping and spinning. Never try to spin it while you're stitching. You will end up getting puckers all over the back and the top of the quilt. So you can go 3 or 4 stitches, lift your presser foot, and spin. On this particular machine, that's called pivot position. It's one of those things that when you do, because all of these could be done with a very, very simple machine, but this is the kind of the perk about having a nicer machine. Pivot position where the presser foot lifts up for me is just glorious. I love, love, love it. All right, gonna come up here. Now I want to show you this because I want to stitch all the way up where this little seam, you can see where that's where I did my fold on my bias right there. You see where the little fold is there? I want to be sure that I stitch all the way up that fold, and then I'll show you how I spin it around when I'm doing it. Because you could, if you chose to, stop right here. But I like to just take and spin the whole block around. Oops, hit a wiggle. Come back a little bit to where I want to continue my stitching, then spin it back around and go in the other direction. Oops, I kept hitting the camera. Please excuse me. And then I can continue. Now, all of this will secure the block, all of these bias bars down. So this is the Appli quilting of this quilt block. This block will take some time to be complete. So you will take your time with the Appli quilting. It's the kind of thing that you want to have like maybe an entire series that you're going to binge watch or a couple of really good movies because it does take quite a bit of time. Oh, I just thought of a good idea. I think you should listen to a book on tape while you're doing it. You could work through that and you won't have to take your eyes off the quilt at all. So one thing I do want to show you when I'm done, this is when I use my scissors and I'll take and I'll cut those threads. So these are the invisible threads. Then I'll go to the back of the quilt, and on the back of the quilt, because my machine has a thread cutter, I'll then take and cut those off. So I will usually work through sections of the quilt and then take off all of the threads, then go back and work through more sections of the quilt. So I might like start over here, then over here, then over here, doing certain ones, cut off the threads, and then come back to those certain areas. If you leave all the threads there, then inevitably the threads are all going to get stitched down on the back and you won't be very happy with your back results. So be sure you work in different sections so you're not accidentally stitching down your threads. So that is the Appli quilting portion of the Quilt As You Go quilt. When we come back next time, I will talk to you about the quilting of the blocks and the quilting of the sashes. Take you to my bigger machine and we'll actually do the free motion quilting there. Remember, all of these designs are available. You can download them from our website, OnPoint-TV. All of the designs are a free download, and we have already, I think, 4 videos in this particular series, so you can go back a few videos from when you found this one to see the ones that started it all off. It's really great if you subscribe to our channel. When you do that and hit the notifications button, you'll get a notification when we download a new video or when we go live, so you'll never lose track of what's happening at OnPoint-TV.